previous video, we did kind of a lengthy look at Ted Tripp's bio, and we saw his education, his vocational background. We saw the influence of nouthetic and biblical counseling on his work. And I think it's pretty unquestionable, both between the overlapping kind of timeline, but also it's on the pages of the book. The principles are there. He acknowledges it. It's kind of without question, that is the framework we're going into it. So you can check out the series I did on nouthetic counseling. I wish I would go back and do it differently now. It's one of the early series I did, but it gives you enough of an overview to kind of know what's going on with nouthetic framework. I also want to underscore the age of this, in the same way that when I first looked at Dobson's Dare to Discipline and realized he wrote that fresh out of his doctoral studies, a father of a toddler and an infant, Ted Tripp was studying all of this as a young man and father of 3. Now to be fair, he wrote his book, Shepherding a Child's Heart. It sounds like he wrote his book when he had teenagers in the home. So it was a little bit more than just theoretical knowledge. However, there was no long range understanding of how these principles played out. There still was a great deal of them were theoretical. It's also worth noting that Tripp would have been parenting as a first-time parent in the growing influence of Dr. Dobson and his model of becoming a Christian parenting expert. Because up until Dobson, there have been a few household names like this. You have Spock, you have maybe different guides coming from the pediatrician, but still primarily, and pastors. I do think in the local church, pastors were giving advice. You have this with the Puritans and others. They're writing about child training, but it was pretty localized until you have Dr. Dobson, when it becomes mass disseminated through radio and media. Tripp would have seen this happening both for Dr. Dobson and for Jay Adams. Both similarly released an explosive book that did very well, generated a lot of questions and conversation, and launched them into speaking, conference ministry, that type of thing. So 20 years later, Tripp himself writes Shepherding a Child's Heart in 1995. And this is the beginning of his time, and he self-identifies this in his LinkedIn bio, but also just on the timeline of when he begins to become a very popular and sought-after conference speaker. Shepherding a Child's Heart seminars were a thing. He traveled globally up until last year. He was still traveling globally, giving conferences and seminars and many different kinds of resources. And so this became a ministry. So what do we do with this information? And as we do these series, I am not only producing content for you, I am organizing my own research notes and thoughts, and I also would like to offer us some case studies of how do we put this all together. So you may be filling in the blanks for this part differently as an individual. I'm presenting the material, but then it's worth asking the question, is this someone I want to hear more from? Someone who has a background in biblical or nouthetic counseling probably is going to say, yes, I want the nouthetic counseling version of parenting, because they're sold on that framework. If you're not, it maybe should be a question mark. Like, this is a mode of thought. So do I want to ingest this? And I'm really harping on this with this resource because this resource was disseminated so widely across denominations, it still is to this day, without bothering to offer that caveat that this is really the framework it is operating under. And so in the same way that someone might hand you a resource and say this is an attachment parenting approach, or this is a conscious parenting approach, or this is an authoritative parenting approach, this should come with this is a nouthetic counseling framework approach on it, because that is clearly the perspective lens that's being brought to parenting. In asking whether we want to listen to someone, it's worth considering not only what they've done, but what they haven't done. And I mentioned this in the first video. So what we have is someone who has a Master of Divinity, which often has a semester of pastoral counseling, sometimes a semester of like family ministry type things. I don't know, maybe he had a specialization in family ministry and a Master of Divinity, But we don't have someone who studied child development. We don't have someone who studied philosophy of education or education principles. We don't have someone who studied psychology, broadly speaking. So it's worth noting that. In the same way, it's worth noting things like Adams developed his program of thought on his own. That doesn't mean there's nothing worthwhile there or that it's completely dismissible, but it is worth saying what are the roots of these ideas and at what level do we trust them as a result. Okay, with the success of this book, Tripp goes on to become basically a household name in Christian parenting. His endorsement is on the back of so many books of the 90s and 2000s. Again and again, if a book had an endorsement from Tripp, it's put up at the top. It is a welcome endorsement. So this book did well. I cannot find hard numbers on how many copies it sold, but it continues to show up on recommended lists of top parenting books. It has 4 and 5 star reviews on Goodreads and Amazon. That's the average. It's high 4 and 5 star reviews. It's still, I hear from many of you that churches are still offering this. As I mentioned before, Tripp and his wife were still doing seminars. They really had an international focus on their ministry, so it had international reach. So if I find some hard numbers on sales, I will share that. I always find that really interesting to imagine, but very influential. Okay, so that gives us some background on Worldview and what's going to be shaping what we're going to find in the book, and we're going to start diving into the chapters.